You know, it's funny how the mind clings to memories of childhood, especially the simple, carefree days. Growing up in Willow Creek, a tiny town surrounded by thick, mysterious forests, my brother Tim and I found our playground in the endless woods behind our house. I was 29 now, but the memories of those days still felt fresh, like they happened just yesterday. We were always exploring, pretending to be adventurers in some lost world, oblivious to the dangers that might have lurked just beyond the trees. Back then, it was just us against the wild, two kids with no sense of fear or caution. We would spend hours wandering through those woods, making up stories about what might be hiding in the shadows. Tim, always the brave one, would lead the way, and I'd follow, trusting that nothing could hurt us as long as we were together. The forest was our kingdom, and every corner held a new secret waiting to be uncovered. I can still hear the sound of leaves crunching under our feet, the distant call of birds, and the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting everything in a golden hue. It was a time of innocence, where the world felt full of endless possibilities. But as I look back now, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. It's strange how the past can change in your mind, how the same memories that once brought comfort can suddenly feel sinister. There was always something about those woods, something that didn't quite sit right. We were too young to understand it then, but there was an unspoken rule, a sense that we shouldn't venture too far, shouldn't push too deep into the heart of the forest. Of course, we didn't listen. We were kids after all, and the thrill of the unknown was too tempting to resist. There was one part of the forest we'd always avoided, though, a dense area where the trees seemed to grow closer together, blocking out the light. Even the birds didn't sing there, and the air felt colder, heavier. Tim and I never talked about it, but we both knew it was off limits, a place that even our childish bravery couldn't penetrate. Yet, as with all forbidden things, the pull of that place only grew stronger with time. The more we stayed away, the more it seemed to call to us, daring us to come closer. And then, one day, we did. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. We were playing near the edge of the forbidden area when Tim stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw it to a faint path, barely visible through the undergrowth, leading into the darkest part of the forest. We stood there for a moment, caught between curiosity and fear, but curiosity won, as it always did with us. We glanced at each other, a silent agreement passing between us, and without a word, we stepped off the beaten track and onto the path that would change everything. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on us from all sides. I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread, like we were on the edge of discovering something amazing, but also something dangerous. Tim was just ahead of me, moving slowly, carefully, as if he could sense the change in the air too. The trees around us were taller here, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. And then, through the thick, tangled undergrowth, we saw a house, old and decaying, hidden deep within the forest. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything changed. The innocence of our childhood was left behind on that path, replaced by something darker, something that would stay with us for the rest of our lives. We had found the house, and with it, we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the forest had been waiting for us, drawing us in, leading us to that house. What happened next? Well, that's a story for another time. But trust me when I say, it's not something you'd want to hear alone at night. I'll never forget the sight of that house, standing there like a forgotten relic from another time. It was as if the forest had grown up around it, slowly swallowing it whole until it became just another part of the landscape. The roof sagged, and the walls were covered in moss and ivy, with windows so caked in dirt that they barely let in any light. It looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in decades, maybe longer. But there was something about it, something that made it impossible to look away. It was eerie, sure, but also kind of fascinating, like it was daring us to come closer. Tim and I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Neither of us said a word, but I could tell he was just as intrigued as I was. It was like the house had a presence, a kind of silent invitation that neither of us could resist. Eventually, Tim took a step forward, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn back, to get out of there, but I couldn't. There was something about that place that pulled us in, like a magnet drawing us closer and closer until we were standing right in front of the door. The door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind blew through the trees. It should have been enough to send us running, but instead, it only made us more curious. We pushed it open slowly, the sound echoing through the silent forest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay hit us immediately. It was dark, the kind of dark that seemed to absorb all the light around it, and the temperature dropped several degrees as soon as we crossed the threshold. The house felt alive, like it was watching us, waiting to see what we would do next. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, like no one had been there in years. The furniture was old and broken, the wallpaper peeling off in long, curling strips. But it was the silence that got to me the most, the way it seemed to press down on us from all sides. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I remember glancing over at Tim, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But we had come this far, and turning back didn't feel like an option anymore. We moved deeper into the house, our footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. Every corner we turned revealed more decay, more evidence that this place had been abandoned long ago. But there was also something else, something that didn't belong. The air felt heavier the further we went, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, like they were reaching out to us. I could feel my pulse quickening, my skin prickling with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I wanted to leave, but at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to turn around. And then we found the room at the end of the hallway. The door was closed, but there was something about it that made us stop in our tracks. The wood was splintered and cracked, as if it had been forced open at some point, and there were deep gouges in the floor leading up to it. It looked different from the rest of the house, like it had been disturbed more recently. I could feel my heart beating in my throat as we stood there, neither of us willing to make the first move. But we had come too far to turn back now. Tim reached for the door, and with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small, dirty window on the far wall. The air was even colder here, and there was a strange smell, something metallic and sharp that made my stomach turn. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw the walls, covered in strange marks, like deep scratches that ran in every direction. The floor was littered with small, white objects that I couldn't quite make out at first. But as I stepped closer, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They were bones, small and brittle, scattered across the floor like leaves. It was at that moment I knew we had made a mistake. We should never have come here, never have crossed that threshold. The house wasn't just abandoned, it was something far worse, something we couldn't understand. And whatever it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. The moment we stepped into that room, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with a kind of tension I couldn't explain, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. Those scratches on the walls, they weren't normal. They were deep, jagged, like something with claws had gone wild in there. It was the kind of thing that made your skin crawl just looking at it. Tim and I exchanged a glance, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. We both knew, without saying a word, that we needed to get out of there. But as we turned to leave, the house seemed to change. The hallway, which had been dark but straightforward, suddenly felt longer, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The shadows seemed to move, growing darker, deeper, almost as if they were alive. Every step we took echoed in the silence, but it wasn't just our footsteps we could hear. There was something else, something just out of sight. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft scratching sound, like nails on wood. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. But that sound, it was getting closer. The closer we got to the front door, the more the house seemed to resist. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing colder with each step. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I could see my breath misting in the air, something that shouldn't have been possible in the middle of summer. Tim was right behind me, but I could feel his fear radiating off him like a heat wave. The door was just ahead, but it felt miles away, like we were running in place, getting nowhere. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I felt like I was moving through molasses. Then, out of nowhere, the scratching sound stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like the world had been swallowed up. We froze, standing there in that dark, twisted hallway, too scared to move. And that's when we heard something breathing. It was slow, heavy, and close, so close it felt like it was right next to us. My skin prickled with a cold sweat, and I could feel my heart stutter in my chest. Whatever was in that house with us, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. I don't know what gave me the courage to move, but somehow, I managed to take a step forward. The air felt like it was pressing down on me, but I forced myself to keep going, to keep pushing toward the door. I could hear Tim's breath coming in ragged gasps behind me, but he was still with me, still moving. We had to get out whatever it took. We had to get out. The shadows around us seemed to shift, twisting and curling like they were alive, but I kept my eyes on the door, refusing to look back, refusing to acknowledge whatever it was that was hunting us. Finally, we reached the front door, but it wasn't over yet. The door wouldn't budge. We pushed and pulled with everything we had, but it was like it was glued shut. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the handle, but I didn't stop, didn't let myself think about what would happen if we couldn't get it open. The sound of that breathing was getting louder, closer, and I could feel the cold air around us thickening, almost solidifying. I knew, deep down, That if we didn't get out now, we never would. This house had us, and it wasn't going to let us leave alive. And then, just as I was about to give up hope, the door flew open. We stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for breath, but the relief was short-lived. As we turned back to look at the house, we could see the shadows inside shifting, moving like they were alive, like they were watching us. The door slammed shut behind us with a force that shook the ground, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, we knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Once we were outside, I thought we'd finally be safe. But as we stood there, catching our breath, I could feel something wasn't right. The air around us felt wrong, thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the fear from inside the house was playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew better. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. Tim was the first to say it, though I could see it in his eyes before the words even left his mouth. "We need to go now." His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, and it sent a chill down my spine. We both knew something was out there with us, something that had followed us out of the house. The thought of it, of whatever had been inside that place now being outside with us, was almost too much to handle. But there was no time to think about it. We had to move, and fast. As we started to walk away, the feeling of being watched turned into something more. It was like a weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch and twist, reaching out towards us as we passed. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see Tim shivering beside me, his breath coming out in short, quick puffs. We weren't just being watched, we were being followed. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, that presence, right behind us, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The further we got from the house, the worse it became. Every step felt like a struggle, like we were walking through water instead of air. The forest, which had always been a place of adventure and fun, now felt like a trap, closing in on us from all sides. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to take over, but I forced it down. We had to stay calm, had to keep moving. Whatever was following us, we couldn't let it see our fear, but that was easier said than done. With every step, the presence grew stronger, more oppressive, until it felt like it was right on top of us. Tim and I kept close, our shoulders brushing as we walked, but even that small comfort did little to ease the terror that was building inside me. The shadows around us seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and moving as if they were alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. I could hear something behind us, something that moved in the darkness, just out of sight. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there, following us, hunting us. We tried to pick up the pace, but it was like the forest was working against us. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It felt like we were going in circles, like the forest itself was trying to keep us from leaving. And all the while, that presence was right behind us, growing stronger, more menacing with every step. My heart was pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I knew we couldn't stop. We couldn't let it catch us. As we finally broke through the edge of the forest, the oppressive weight lifted, just slightly. But even as we stumbled into the open air, I could still feel it just out of sight, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. It wasn't over. We had escaped the house, but whatever was inside it had followed us out. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to let us go that easily. The moment we broke free from the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was fleeting, almost immediately replaced by a surge of fear that gripped me tighter than ever. We were out of the forest, but we weren't safe, not by a long shot. That presence, the one that had been lurking just behind us, wasn't about to let us go. It felt like the air around us thickened, pressing down as if the very atmosphere was trying to pull us back. The house might have been behind us, but whatever had followed us out of there wasn't done with us yet. Tim grabbed my hand, and we started to run. It wasn't a decision we made. It was pure instinct, the kind of primal reaction you have when you know something is chasing you. Our feet pounded against the ground, and the world around us became a blur as we sprinted for our lives. I could hear Tim's breath, ragged and desperate, matching my own. But it wasn't just our breaths I could hear, there was something else. Something in the wind, a whispering, almost a growl, that seemed to follow us, growing louder with every step. The once familiar path home now seemed twisted, distorted, as if the very landscape was working against us. Trees that had once marked the way now seemed like obstacles, their branches reaching out like claws, snagging at our clothes and slowing us down. I could feel the presence gaining on us, closing the distance with every heartbeat. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare. If I stopped, if I slowed down even for a second, I knew it would be the end. I could feel it breathing down my neck, that cold, foul breath that sent shivers down my spine. The chase felt like it went on forever, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare where the faster we ran, the further away safety seemed. I glanced over at Tim, and the look in his eyes nearly broke me. He was scared, no. He was terrified. But there was something else there too, something that pushed us forward despite the fear. Determination. We couldn't let it catch us. We couldn't let it win. Whatever it took, we had to keep going. We had to make it home. But the closer we got to the edge of town, the more the world seemed to warp around us. The shadows grew darker, the air thicker, until it felt like we were running through a dream or a nightmare. I could hear that presence right behind us now, so close I could almost feel it reaching out to grab us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even slow down. The fear was like a living thing, driving me forward, refusing to let me give in to the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the world seemed to snap back into focus. The air cleared, the shadows receded, and suddenly, we were on the edge of town, the familiar houses and streetlights coming into view. We stumbled onto the pavement, gasping for breath, but we didn't stop running. Not until we reached home, not until we were safely behind closed doors. Only then did we finally collapse, our backs against the door, trying to catch our breath. But even as we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. We had escaped for now, but that presence, it was still out there, waiting, watching. As I looked at Tim, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, I knew we couldn't pretend this hadn't happened. We couldn't just go back to our normal lives, not after this. Whatever had chased us, whatever had followed us out of that house, it wasn't going to just disappear. And somehow, deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning. The relief of making it home didn't last long. As we sat there, backs against the door, trying to catch our breath, I felt a strange sensation on my arm, a kind of tingling that wasn't there before. At first, I thought it was just the adrenaline wearing off, but when I looked down, my heart nearly stopped. There, on my forearm, was a mark, a jagged, angry-looking line that hadn't been there before we went into the forest. It wasn't a scratch or a bruise. It was something else. Something that seemed almost unnatural. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The mark was red and swollen, like it had been burned into my skin, and it pulsed with a dull, aching pain that sent shivers down my spine. Tim noticed me looking at it and his face went pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. The mark felt like a parting gift from whatever had chased us out of that house, a reminder that it wasn't done with us yet. Over the next few days, the mark didn't fade like a normal wound would. If anything, it seemed to grow darker, more pronounced, as if it was digging deeper into my skin. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it would go away on its own, but it was impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at it, I felt that same cold dread I had felt in the house, like the mark was a connection to whatever dark force we had encountered. And it wasn't just the mark. Strange things started happening, things I couldn't explain. It started small objects moving on their own, doors creaking open in the middle of the night, shadows where there shouldn't be any. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that the fear from that day had messed with my mind. But then Tim started noticing it too. We'd hear whispers, faint but unmistakable, coming from the corners of the room, or we'd feel a cold breeze pass through the house, even when all the windows were closed. The mark on my arm would throb whenever these things happened, like it was connected to the strange occurrences. And each time it happened, I could feel the fear tightening its grip on me. The nightmares were the worst. Every night, I'd dream of that house, of the dark, twisted hallways and the thing that had chased us through the forest. But in the dreams, it would always catch me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the mark on my arm burning like fire, and the sense of dread would be so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. Tim wasn't sleeping much either, and the dark circles under his eyes were proof that he was having his own nightmares. We didn't talk about it, didn't want to acknowledge what was happening, but we both knew that whatever had marked me was still out there, waiting. As the days turned into weeks, the mark became more than just a physical reminder. It was like it was a part of me now, a constant, gnawing presence that I couldn't escape. I'd catch myself staring at it for long periods of time, almost hypnotized by the way it seemed to pulse and move under my skin. And the strange occurrences in the house only got worse. Lights flickering, footsteps in the hallway at night, and that feeling of being watched, always there, always lurking just out of sight. It was like the house was alive, or worse, like it was being watched by something we couldn't see. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal when it clearly wasn't. The mark wasn't going away, and the things that were happening in the house were getting more and more intense. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever had marked me was getting stronger, more desperate, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. But what that was, I had no idea, and that terrified me more than anything. It wasn't long before the pull to return to the forest became impossible to ignore. Every time I tried to go about my day, the mark on my arm would throb, a constant reminder that something unfinished was waiting for me. The nightmares grew more vivid, more insistent, each one pulling me back to that dark, twisted house. I knew, deep down, that I had to go back, had to face whatever it was that had marked me. It felt like the forest itself was calling me, whispering to me in the dead of night, promising answers that I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Tim begged me not to go. He could see the toll it was taking on me, the way the mark had changed me, and he was terrified of what might happen if I went back. But I couldn't stay away. I was drawn to that place like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the pull no matter how much I tried. I told him I'd be careful, that I wouldn't go far, but we both knew I was lying. There was no way to do this halfway. I had to go all the way, back to the house, back to where it all began. It was the only way to end this. The walk through the forest was different this time. It felt darker, more oppressive, as if the trees themselves were closing in on me, guiding me back to the house. The path seemed clearer now, more direct, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I could feel the mark on my arm burning with each step, growing hotter as I got closer to the house. It was almost like it was alive, reacting to the presence of whatever was waiting for me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being pulled by an invisible force, something stronger than my fear, stronger than my reason. When I finally reached the house, it looked different too. It was still old and decaying, still covered in moss and ivy, but there was something more menacing about it now, something that sent a chill down my spine the moment I saw it. The windows were dark, like the eyes of some ancient, malevolent creature, and the air around it was thick with the scent of decay. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when I was this close. The inside of the house was just as I remembered it, but with one crucial difference. The air was thick with a presence, something so tangible it was almost suffocating. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The mark on my arm burned like fire, pulsing in time with my racing heart. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there before it was too late, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait for whatever was coming. And then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving in the corner of my eye. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the periphery of my vision, but it grew stronger, more defined, until it was unmistakable. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and warp, taking on shapes that didn't belong in the natural world. The presence was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality. Something solid, something dangerous. I could feel it closing in on me, and for the first time, I truly understood what I was up against. I knew then that this was the end game, the final confrontation between me and whatever had marked me all those years ago. I had been brought back here for a reason, and I could feel the weight of that reason pressing down on me, suffocating me. The house, the forest, the mark, they were all connected, all part of a bigger picture that I was only beginning to understand. But understanding didn't make it any less terrifying. I was standing on the edge of something vast and dark, and there was no turning back. The only way out was through, and whatever waited on the other side, I knew it would change me forever.